Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Applying Ethology webinar. I'm Laura Whalen, and together with Jen-Yan Chow, Christian Nara, and Sebastian Gramon, we organize these webinars in the Animal Welfare Slack workspace. As we begin today, I want to remind you all to please turn off your camera and microphone. Should you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Holly Vickery, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Reading. Holly studies how the management of dairy goat kids influences their behavior, welfare, and productivity. In today's presentation, Holly will discuss how goat kids are managed, farmers' willingness to change their management practices, and strategies to improve the care of goat kids. Welcome, Holly.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And I think good evening to most people who are joining us today. And it's really nice to have this opportunity to talk about my PhD research as a bit more of a whole than I have done before. So if you see me talk at conferences and things, I've generally been giving a very distinct study overview. Whereas today I'm going to talk a bit more cohesively about how my research that I've done for my PhD forms a whole body of work. So generally, I'm going to be talking about meeting the needs of farmers and animals and how we can use mixed methodology approaches to understand and improve the artificial rearing of goat kids. So why goat kids? Well, we know a lot about calves. They have really extensive research. They have generally individualized care. Commonly, they're fed on restricted milk with some individual and small group housing. And they generally have technology assisted weaning. And then we have goat kids. The last review of goat kid literature was in 1988. It's a really long time ago when we compare with the extensive literature that's available for calf rearing. They're typically managed in quite large groups with a lack of individualized care. And this could well be because they're economically worth less as an individual compared to a calf, and therefore they're much more likely to be treated on this sort of whole group level. The majority of them are fed on ad libitum milk when reared in large groups, and we lack any technology to be able to monitor milk intakes, solid feed intakes, or anything like that. And really, my point here is that these two animals are not equal. They are not the same. And typically, whenever we've been looking at how goat kids are reared and how we could change their management, we've been drawing on the research that's done for dairy calves without really knowing if that's appropriate. Research needs to consider species-specific behavioural and physiological needs as well as management practices. And that's key here, because we know very little about goat kids in terms of how they're managed, and if those species-specific differences mean that the way in which they react to management changes could really, really differ from the way that calves do, and it might be quite unexpected. Now, the global goat population stands at over 1 billion, and it's gone up about 16% over the last 10 years. So it's quite a growing industry. And we've seen an increase in the number of intensive and industrialized dairy goats farms that are coming into production. So my research plan coming into my PhD at the end of 2018, so a while ago now, I'm just finishing up. And the overall aim that I came up with was to investigate the behaviour, productivity, and individuality of artificially reared goat kids during the milk feeding period and weaning transition, because we know that's a really high risk stage for young ruminants, in order to make recommendations for how on-farm management could be improved. So my research plan. First, I really needed to know how the goat kids are currently being reared. And that's something that we had specific data on for very specific countries, quite small scale. And I just thought it interesting to look at all kids that are being artificially reared. Secondly, I wanted to find out from that same survey, are farmers willing to change their current management? What are those barriers? Why might they not be willing to change? And that meant that I could then tailor my animal-based research in order to make sure that it's feasible for farmers to use. So the third part of my PhD was a study actually finding out about how goat kids feed from these ad libitum milk feeders, because there was absolutely no data telling me how they feed from them. And then working out whether there are feasible gradual weaning strategies from these ad lib systems to improve growth and welfare. And I do also have a fifth study for my PhD, which is about individuality, which isn't quite ready to share yet, but it should be going under review, hopefully this week when I send it in. So the survey, which was really stage number 1 of my research plan. And it was really important to focus on the milk feeding weaning stage because we know that's the highest risk period where we see a lot of morbidity and mortality. Research has really focused on adults with less known about kid management. And understanding farmers' views is absolutely essential to research uptake. We can do lots of different research and we could find out our own ideas about methodology. But without knowing how to tailor it to what commercial farms are physically able to do, then it's a really low likelihood that farmers will go on to take that research and put it into practice and therefore actually improve kid welfare. So I had a survey, which we sort of called Rearing Goat Kids Away from Their Dams. And there are two parts to it. And these became two separate research papers. So the first one was all about understanding current rearing methods. What are you doing with your goat kids now? Whereas part 2 was about how willing farmers would be to change their management. So asking farmers questions about specific strategies and how willing they would be to try them. It was anonymous, it was recall based. We distributed it in person and online in 3 languages, so English, French, and Dutch, to target where there are larger commercial herds of goats. We used Likert scales, open text, and option based questions. I did thematic analysis of those open text responses and used Friedman tests with postdocs, Wilcoxon signed rank tests for the others. I'm going to briefly take you over my results, focusing on what's most relevant to what I'm going to be talking about today. So firstly, in terms of milk feeding system by country, so what we saw was that we had a range of different systems used, and we broadly put these into 3 categories. So we had ad libitum milk feeding. These are farmers that are allowing their kids to have constant and unrestricted access to milk. Bottle feeding and other systems. So bottle feeding is set meals per day, and other systems would tended to be a mix of these. There are a few different ways that farmers did it. Some were allowing them partial access to ad lib milk, so they were refilling a trough, but they were generally drinking it quite quickly, so they didn't quite fit in either category. And you can see here that there was some variation. But actually, the most important part of this was that farmers that were rearing greater than 100 kids per year were most likely to be ad libitum feeding. So this shows that those are the systems that tend to be used by those larger scale commercial farms. And that's really because of labour inputs. It's much simpler to rear a large number of kids on an ad libitum system. They typically use machines, which means that you just put the powder in, hook it up to water, and it supplies milk constantly to teats that sit in the pen. Much less labour than if you're using a meal-based system. And one of the interesting parts was when we looked at the way that they weaned by the number of kids reared. And so abruptly weaned is the white part of the box and gradually weaned is that shaded bar part. And you can see that abrupt weaning became much more common with the number of kids reared. So overall, abrupt weaning happened less. It occurred in 28.8%, and gradual was in 71.2%, which seems quite positive. But actually, abrupt weaning was significantly more likely from those ad lib systems, which were more likely to be those greater number of kids. So there are a lot of kids going through those systems of ad lib milk feeding and then abrupt weaning. In terms of weaning management, what we saw is quite a lot of variation in those who were gradually weaning. So very, very commonly that it was a reduction in milk quantity that they were using as a way to wean their kids gradually. Dilution of milk was really uncommon, which is surprising because it is a strategy that has been trialled for use, with people thinking that it might be something that farmers would be quite willing to do. But they generally, if they were gradually weaning, weren't using that strategy. And it tended to be quite a long gradual weaning period for those farms that were using it. So the most common period was over 29 days, so over a month of stepping down that milk supply, which is quite an important consideration when we think about the development of kids' rumens and how able they are to cope with the lack of milk. But what we really identified with the survey is that a key concern for us in terms of welfare, in terms of health, in terms of productivity, was this abrupt weaning from ad libitum milk systems. So what we wanted to do, because we thought this might be an issue, was ask the farmers about how willing they would be to use gradual weaning if they were currently ad lib feeding, if they were currently abruptly weaning, sorry. So we asked them how willing they would be to adopt a gradual weaning method from an ad libitum milk feeder. So these were the farmers that were currently abruptly weaning from these systems. And we gave them 3 different strategies to choose from. We said decrease the ratio of milk powder to water, so essentially dilution, reduce the milk temperature to cold, which is sometimes proposed in industry as a way to get them to drink less milk, or remove the ad libitum teats for a set period of hours per day. And what we really saw is the circled medians there. They were really quite unwilling to use any of these strategies. And when we asked farmers about this, we saw some real common themes. So the most common one that farmers are really concerned about, and this is something that's reflected in the conversations that I've had when I've been on farm and been to open days, is that there's an issue around machine level changes. And this is because they use these ad libitum milk machines that mix milk and supply it in teats to a large number of pens. So these teats are generally attached to the feeder, just long lines, generally left open on the pen, and there'll be lots in different pens. On the farm that I've been working with, they've used splits in the teat lines, which means that they can feed 16 teats from this one feeder. And that means you get a really large age range of kids being fed by this one feeder. And that's what concerned the farmers, because if they did something on the machine level and did dilution or reducing the temperature, and they had kids that varied in age, often, 6 to 8 weeks, the whole kidding period, then they're going to be weaning kids far younger or far older than they wanted to if they tried to find a middle ground. They're also quite concerned about health, and a lot of farmers were saying that if they took the milk teats away, as we proposed, and then reinstated the milk access, they believe the kids would compensatory feed and overfeed during that time, which they felt could result in scouring, diarrhea, and bloat, which is a real concern in terms of mortality. They also thought it might affect feeding competition, and therefore you'd get the strongest kids able to get access to milk when they first reinstated the access, and therefore there would be some competitive injuries and issues around competitive interactions. So that was a key concern for them. So this is a bit strange. That is the same one. That was the rest of the comments that I was just talking about. So they were really concerned about this idea that if they're deprived of milk for a certain period, they will force feed themselves afterwards, and they would see things like bloat, and then also things like issues with getting staff to change routine. And that sort of feasibility concern, which when you're on a commercial farm, there's some things that are really key to getting them to actually implement changes. And when we talked to them about the importance of factors when deciding whether or not they'd implement a management change, we really saw that all of these factors were quite important to them. The medians are circled in red. And so all of these factors were something that they would base these decisions on, which really highlights the amount of different factors that are competing in terms of deciding how to implement a management change. And that if we're going to propose changes for farmers to make, we have to be aware that all of these things are strong considerations for them. So amount of labour and time required, the cost, and then the scientific evidence are all factors that are on a pretty level playing field when it comes to farmers' decision making. And in terms of overall barriers to uptake, we really saw that feasibility and practicality concern, and this is the same whenever I speak to farmers at open days. And I really like this quote from one of the farmers who said, well, we're practical. Farmers have to be. If changing a practice does have benefit in the long run and has some backing, then most of them will entertain the thought. But whatever the suggestion is, it must be practical. So they're just telling us that we need to be able to give them things that they can use without having to make huge amounts of changes. Economics, key concern, inputs need to be justified by output. And they're saying that actually when they read scientific reports on welfare, some of them just aren't quantifiable. They don't talk to them about costs and what the differences could be when they make these changes. People talked about the lack of research. So generally with goat kids, people feel that there isn't species-specific research and they don't quite know what to do. Should they listen to lamb research? Should they choose calf research? There isn't that goat-specific knowledge for them to draw on. And some of them actually said, well, we prefer anecdotal. We like to listen to other people's experience. We like things that are tried and tested, and those sorts of comments as well. So I think it's really important that we remember that barriers to uptake are something we should be considering when we're planning welfare research, because otherwise we might not be able to have the impact that we want to have on farm. So in terms of key takeaway messages from the surveys, well, bottle feeding was more common, but ad libitum milk feeding is more likely in systems rearing greater than 100 kids. And gradual weaning was more common, but less likely to be used within those ad libitum systems that are on a larger scale. In terms of gradual weaning, which we think is something that would really benefit kids, there was this perceived negative impact on animal health, which was a major barrier. So this concern around them scouring, around not being able to dilute milk because that would cause an issue, not being able to take teats off and put them on because they think that will also cause an issue. So that was something that was a real major concern for our farmers. And there was no literature out there to address it. I keep hearing from loads of different people that I talk to, even industry reps, and I've seen it written in guidance for farmers that abrupt weaning reduces the chances of bloat, and that's why you should do it. And it's really commonly stated when it comes to lambs. But there's absolutely no papers out there that say that that is a thing and that quantify it, which I thought was really interesting because nobody that I spoke to could quite tell me where that key phrase had come from. So really, we do need research that investigates feeding competition and milk intakes. And feasibility is crucial. Farmers do not have the individualized tech that they have on dairy cow farms, and therefore strategies do need to be pen level, otherwise they're simply not going to be able to use them. And barriers to uptake, well, practicalities are essential, which is something that really we should know when it comes to farms. And one of the key things here is actually, why should farmers change? We need to be giving them incentives. We need to be showing them that there can be a better way. So research should consider farmers' perspectives before it's planned. And actually, our findings should really aim to quantify a range of incentives, including kid health, including cost and labour analyses. And that's something that I've been sort of promoting as much as I can and saying to as many researchers as I can. If you can manage to collect that data, please try to include it in your papers and in your findings. So what do we know about ad libitum milk? We found out that it's common in those larger numbers of kids, and we might have some concerns around its use. So what do we currently know? Well, calves that are on a high milk intake, we know that ad libitum gives them higher weight gains, a more natural behavioural ethogram, and has some really positive impacts. But let's focus now on some of the challenges. So we have well-documented intakes and overall feeding behaviours in calves that tell us that it is beneficial. But you do see decreased solid feed intake post-weaning when calves have been on a high milk intake. And you do therefore see reduced growth post-weaning, which is likely linked to that lack of rumen development that enables them to transition efficiently onto solid feed. There's really quite limited goat research. So we know from my survey that it's associated with rearing greater than 100 kids, and that's been reflected in other surveys that say it's the most common rearing method for dairy goats across the world. It is associated with decreased solid feed intake, but that's from a really old paper with a very limited study size and a load of disease issues. What we don't know about ad libitum milk is how the kids use these feeding systems. We don't know anything about their intakes and their pattern of usage, and that would be incredibly useful. Because even when it came to planning my research, I couldn't do effective budgeting for my research because I had no idea how much milk powder these kids were going to drink because nobody could tell me how much kids drank on ad lib systems. So it seemed really important to learn more about those ad lib milk feeding behaviours. So that's how I came up with my feeding and weaning studies and planned the next stage of my research. So the first aim of this was to describe the feeding behaviour of the goat kids that were reared on an ad libitum milk feeding system. And the second aim was to determine the effect of weaning strategy, abrupt versus gradual, on feed intake, growth, and overall welfare, so that we could see whether or not we can recommend it for use on commercial farms. So my idea was to do this in one study by using the kids that are on the abrupt weaning treatment as the descriptors for the feeding behaviour study. So in terms of the feeding behaviour, well, we want to describe the feeding behaviour on goat kids reared on an ad lib milk feeding system. So I had 16 castrated male dairy breed goat kids. They were in 2 pens and they had 1 milk teat per pen, ad lib milk water, creep hay and straw. And this was chosen to be reflective of commercial conditions. In terms of feeding, I was able to get individual level milk feeding data. And then each day, hopefully this video is also working for you, I went in and got thoroughly beaten up by the goat kids whilst I was collecting pen level daily hay, straw, creep and water intake. Weights were taken on arrival, weekly and the last day of each study period, and I did health observations at each weighing session. And I did GLMs with backwards elimination to find out how important different factors were on average daily gain, SMIMS rank correlations to look at the association between solid feeding variables and age, meal criterions were fitted using a mixture of Gaussian, and mixed models were used to then look at feeding behaviour variables. So I'm going to take you through the key results now. So in terms of learning to use this milk feeder and then feeder station visits, we saw a real marked individual variation of how long it took for the kids to learn to use this milk feeder. So the mean was 7.75 days. So this was when I picked them up from the farm, brought them here and started training them how to use the milk tea. But some of them were learning it in just 2 days, and others were taking as long as 15 before they were going and feeding from the milk teat independently without me having to help them. And if anyone follows me on Twitter, then you'll know that Dobby, who stayed here, he was one of the fools who took a really long time to learn to use that milk teat. He wasn't one of the bright sparks in the experiment. And one of the other areas where we saw really marked individual variation is in how many times they would visit the milk feeding station and drink milk each day. So you can see here there's a mean of 8.4, but that range was really large. And we had some kids that consistently chose to drink in fewer milk meals per day. So there's definitely some individuality going on here that needs some further investigation to understand, because that might impact how they cope, how they are able to cope if they were on bottle-based systems. Because some kids were feeding on average 5 meals a day and others were 13.5 meals a day. And those kids that really seemed to need or choose to feed on fewer meals per day might not cope well if you put them in a meal-based system where they only get offered 2 meals a day. In terms of milk intake, what we saw is that both mean daily milk intake and mean milk intake per meal were rising at that industry standard time of weaning, which is 56 days of age. And the mean milk intake was 2 litres a day with a range from 1.6 to 2.4. So again, quite a big variation. In terms of meal criterions, these were fitted by a statistics whiz. So a mixture of 2 Gaussians were fitted to the log of the intervals between kid visits, and then visits that belonged by maximum likelihood to the first were compressed into a single meal, as in David et al. 2014, who did this for lambs. So what we found is that individual meals had a threshold of 1 hour and 24 minutes. So we counted anything within that cutoff as being one milk meal. And so mean meals per day were 5.9 and mean meal time was 4.2. And they visited the feeding station 1.4 times per meal on average. And none of those were associated with age. So we didn't see any decline in the amount of time that they were feeding and the amount of meals that they're feeding in per day. We also wanted to look at social meals because we were interested if the kids wanted to access that milk teat at the same time. So this came up with quite a low threshold when we fitted the Gaussians of 3 minutes and 10 seconds. So 57% of feeds within that criteria were individual, which makes sense because it's quite low. 31% consisted of 2 or 3 kids, 12% greater than 4. But 74% of all milk intake occurred within meals of greater than 2 kids. So they did consume more when they were consuming it sort of socially. And again, this is where we saw real marked individuality. Most of the kids showed a common trend in how likely they were to attend meals of different sizes. But we had 3 kids in particular who showed a really low likelihood of feeding by themselves. They typically were joined by other kids. This would be interesting to investigate further to see if there's anything around sort of followers and leaders, some sort of social contagion that depends on the rank of the kid. That sort of investigation would be really interesting to do. In terms of average daily gain and milk intake, the most significant predictor was an interaction between milk intake and week, which makes sense as milk intake is positively correlated with their age. Weight gains averaged 200 grams a day with quite a large variation again, ranging from 120 to 220. But this is comparable to down-reared kids that average 163 grams a day. So it seems that those ad-lib milk feeding systems are doing what they should be doing, and they're making sure that kids do feed sort of quite comparably to natural conditions and gain the same level of weight. In terms of feed intakes, I'll just whiz through all of these and look at creep because this is the most interesting. So industry guidelines tell us that concentrate intake should be greater than 250 grams a day at the time of weaning, which is indicated here with a solid marker line. But at weaning, our kids' intake was just 64 grams a day, and the week following weaning, they had to increase by greater than 600% to 392 grams a day. And that's a huge change for the digestion of that kid, and that rumen development is unlikely to be there to efficiently digest that. And therefore, they're unlikely to cope well with the loss of milk nutrients and be able to compensate properly by increasing their intakes of solid feed. So we saw that daily milk meals contrast to bottle-fed kids. So most farmers in our survey fed 3 to 4 meals a day when the kids were 8 days old, and 10% fed 2. And the vast majority of those further decrease after 8 days. Most are just 1 bottle a day, which is really different to how these ad-lib kids were choosing to feed. Milk intake was still rising at weaning, and it coincided with a dramatic increase of solid feed and water intakes. And those kids were just not meeting solid feed intake guidelines, which is a concern. And that individuality could do with being investigated further. It would be really useful to understand the factors that contribute towards differences. Now, what about those gradual weaning kids that were in the same study? We knew that it needed to be pen level and feasible and age-based because that's what farmers do. So we came up with 3 treatments: abrupt, fully ad lib until they're weaned; gradual 1, teats were off for 3.5 hours a day for 10 days, starting at 5 weeks. And then the teats were off for a 7-hour block for 10 days, and then they were weaned. Gradual 2, the teats were off for 3.5 hours in that 10 days, the same. And then teats were off for 7 hours a day, but in 2 3.5-hour blocks with a period where we reinstated milk access in between. So I did 2 experiments for this, and experiment 1 was on a commercial farm to find out whether or not it would be feasible. It had a large number of kids, so 261 in total, spread across the weaning treatments. The weight gain data was from 159 female kids because they didn't put individual ID tags in the males, so I couldn't collect individual weight data from them. And then I group scan sampled 7 pens for behavioural data. Now, the experiment 1 results I'll just talk about quite briefly because they were fairly all over the place. Weight gain. So when they had the same treatment, both of those gradual weaning groups, gradual weaning 2 had significantly high average daily gain, no differences in weaning 2. And we only did a 4-day post-weaning period because the farms moved the kids. And so the abrupt weaning kids had significantly higher average daily gain over those 4 days, but it's not going to be reflective of true weight gain, is more likely to be gut fill. Behaviour, again, a little bit all over the place when you work on a commercial farm. So we saw a pre-weaning treatment difference, which was a problem. Weaning 1, when the treatment differences were the same, there were no treatment differences. Again, we saw a difference where we would have liked not to have seen one. And post-weaning, the gradually weaned 2 kids, so that was that 2 3.5-hour period when we had lower frustrated suckling motivation. But farm workers did find it feasible, and we didn't see any detrimental impacts. That was a tick to go on to do this under research conditions and collect more detailed data. So we need to understand that in more detail to get those individual milk intakes. So I had 33 male castrated kids across 4 pens, collected weight and milk feeding data on an individual level from all of them, pen level solid feeding behaviour, and behaviour data from 1 pen of each. So in terms of feed intake, we thought, hey, it was pretty similar between all of them, but actually abruptly weaned kids consumed a bit more throughout. In terms of straw, again, the abruptly weaned kids just consumed more straw the whole time. And water, we actually saw that the gradually weaned kids consumed more post-weaning, which is really important for their rumen development. But the most sort of important and interesting, because we have a lot of data about how creep or concentrate starter feeds are beneficial, was this creep intake. And we saw that these kids did hit that industry guideline that they weren't hitting when they were abruptly weaned. So pre-weaning, actually, the abruptly weaned kids were just eating more creep. probably a social difference. There might have been kids there who really got into the creep much faster. But then that reversed. So throughout the weaning periods, the gradually weaned kids were consuming more, and post-weaning it trended towards being more, with a P of 0.073. So what about compensatory feeding? This is the thing that farmers were really concerned about. Our kids are going to gorge when we give the milk teats back. They're going to bloat. They're going to scour. Well, we just didn't see that. These arrows indicate where the teats were put back on after a period of milk removal. And as you can see, they didn't feed over and above the level that they were normally feeding at, or the level that the abruptly weaned kids that had the ad lib milk the whole time were feeding at. And in terms of weight gain data and milk intakes, what we saw is that actually treatment was significant in that weaning 2 period for both. So the gradually weaned kids had higher average daily gain during weaning 2 when they had less milk, and they were drinking less milk during that second weaning period. And we didn't quite see a significant difference post-weaning, but it was reasonably close. In terms of behaviour, the gradually weaned kids during weaning 1 had higher activity towards water, lower activity towards hay, and almost higher towards creep. Weaning 2, the gradually weaned kids had lower general play, which could be indicative of their welfare state or nutritional state, because they were consuming less milk and had less access to milk during that time. But post-weaning, we saw the opposite. The gradually weaned kids had higher levels of general play, which could be indicative of them having a better welfare state post-weaning. They had higher activity towards water and lower towards straw. One of the things that I really wanted to do for the farmers was look at economic implications. So we used the estimated marginal means that came out of the models to estimate just how much the kids were costing. So we had that milk intake per kid per period, which we could calculate into milk powder cost, and creep intake per kid per period, which is calculated into creep cost. So whilst we saw much higher intakes of creep, it was compensated for financially by lower intake of milk for those gradually weaned kids. And on average, they cost £1.13 less for that weaning period. So that's just 35 to 70 days. So gradual weaning, discussion and conclusions. Well, the results were varied between that commercial farm versus the research conditions. So there are possible social impacts, and they had larger groups on the commercial farm, which could have caused greater feeding competition, which is likely to impact how successful that milk removal and reinstatement period is. Weaning timings is something that we really need to explore. Now we know it's not detrimental and might actually have a lot of benefits. We really need to unpick this in greater detail. When should we start removing milk intake, and for how long should we do it to get optimum results? So a study by Zobel et al. 2019 did a 6-day gradual weaning period from day 57 to 63 and saw no significant impacts, which makes sense to me because that's quite a late time to start it, and that's a really short period of time. Magistrelli et al. 2013 did a 19-day period and also saw no significant impacts. So this is something where we really need some more work to optimize those weaning protocols. Well, application for use. It's a really simple and feasible strategy. You literally just have to go and unscrew the milk teat and then screw it back on when you want to give it back. We have demonstrated that it has economic gains whilst improving welfare. And as feed intake is absolutely critical to rumen development, anything that gets them to eat more of that concentrate feed when they're being fed high levels of milk is really, really key and should be implemented for use on farm. So the overall implications of this body of work that I've been working on for the last 4 and a bit years. Well, abrupt weaning from ad libitum milk supply is a key welfare concern and is used on those commercial farms very commonly. Gradual weaning strategies do need some further investigation to optimise protocols, but could well mitigate those concerns and improve welfare. Goat kids do show marked individuality in a number of different ways, which does need further investigation because it could well be impacting how they respond to these different strategies. And actually, understanding management systems is key to applied research. We need to know what's happening in order to tailor what we do. And identifying farmers' concerns allows our research findings to address them. Finding out that farmers were worried about compensatory feeding meant that I could really clearly put that finding into my research paper and say that it wasn't an issue. I also monitored the kids for bloat half an hour, 1 hour, and 2 hours after the reinstatement of the teats, and I saw absolutely no incidences. So that could help to alleviate their concerns. Applied research really should involve participatory engagement and also a stage of tailoring the research. And the question that I like to ask myself is, why should farmers use my research? What can I give them as an incentive to say that it is useful or it is helpful in some way? So being able to include a range of possible incentives within our findings is a really important way to improve research uptake. I'd just like to take a second to acknowledge everyone who's helped me throughout this PhD, all the farmers who did the survey. Volac in particular provided the milk feeder and the milk powder. And my family gave up their barn, which I borrowed during COVID to put the goat kids in and do this study. And my little brother made all of the milk feeding stations to enable this research, as well as everyone who funded me and my supervisors. And this is where you can find my research. And thank you ever so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed all the goat pictures, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for a beautiful presentation, Holly. It was really great to see almost your entire thesis unfold. So thank you for taking the time to put the pieces together and share the full story. I hope that people feel comfortable to type in questions into the chat box. And while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I have a few to get us started. You brought up individual differences a few times, and that different goat kids may consume different numbers of meals, or they may show preferences for social companions when feeding. And I wonder if you've thought about what a dream milk feeding system might look like for goat kids.
Oh, that's quite a fun question. So I think it'd be really interesting, slightly tangential to what you're asking, to understand a bit more about that individuality, because I think the optimum milk feeding system might look different for different goat kids. There seem to be some kids that are very gregarious and really thrive on these large social groups, and they're really playful and super active. And therefore they'd be very happy in mixed large pens. And they don't mind a bit of feeding competition. They're able to cope quite well with it. But you do then see those kids that are less affiliative to novelty. They're more nervous. They struggle a bit more in their social interactions. And therefore, they would be much happier in a smaller pen with less kids, more hiding spaces, and an ability to access the teat more easily. So I think that's where we have to be a bit careful, because in some ways, I feel like I want to say we need to put some sort of protection around the milk teats, because on the commercial farms, they tend to be on a flat surface, just milk teats, and they push each other off very, very easily. But it does also enable less dominant kids to sneak in and drink. Whereas if we make a feeding station that protects them, I then worry that we just move the competition back a bit to the entrance of the feeding station. And I think that's something that we need to understand a bit more. But ad libitum milk supply is great for them in so many ways, and we see lots of gains. The issue is that the cost of milk powder is rising all the time, and it's teetering on the edge of becoming economically unviable for a lot of farmers. So they're all looking for strategies to cut down milk supply, and they want to wean them younger. So we need to balance between all the great benefits of ad lib feeding. It's better for them behaviourally, it's better for their growth, whilst finding a way to motivate them to actually start developing their rumen young enough for when farmers want to wean them. And I'm not quite sure I have the answer yet as to what that perfect system would look like, but finding that optimal balance, I think, is going to be absolutely key. So I like this idea of ad lib for a certain period of time when it's most crucial for them, so they can help themselves. We went for 5 weeks where they all got it ad lib. I think I was quite comfortable with that, because there's a bit of research that says you can wean them as young as 5 weeks. And then a period of step down weaning would definitely be optimal.
To follow up with that, you might not be able to answer that in this, and if you can't, that's quite okay. But it's interesting that it seems like there's such a precedent to feed goat kids ad libitum, where in the dairy calf world, that's not there at all. And trying to get people to feed calves more and more milk is a very difficult task. And so, I know you mentioned in the presentation that it was ease of management, but do you know historically why they feed goat kids so much milk?
It's interesting. I thought the same when I came to this because yeah, calf feeding started in the opposite way, and the researchers had to prove that high milk intakes are really beneficial and let's feed calves more. Whereas with goats, it's really strange because there's a complete difference in the way the farmers think because calf rearers are really concerned that if you feed them too much milk, then they get health issues, which is fascinating because goat farmers are like, let's get the kids to grow really fast. We don't care. We just give them ad lib milk teats. They just historically, it's just always been the way it's done on these large dairy farms. But I think it's primarily a case of feasibility. So goat have never been individually penned. They are economically worth very little compared to a calf. A goat kid is double figures. It's not going to cost you more than 50 quid for probably a really good one when it's young, which is and free. The males are free and fiver, they're really cheap compared to calves, and therefore they tend to be handled on this group basis, and they accept a higher level of loss because of that, because they're worth less. And a lot of that's related to goats generally having twin births, twins or triplets. Cows generally have singles, and your rate of replacement is therefore very different. So they've always been put in group pens. And then the easiest way to feed them was to stick a teat in there that has a line that leads into a bucket of warm milk that you keep topping up. And then these feeders were developed that mix it on demand. And it's incredibly different. And I think it is largely based around that group level way of care compared to calves.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much for going into detail on that, Holly. It looks like there's some questions coming in. One from Abul says, did you have any economic calculations about cost and return related to goat welfare?
So I only have the economic calculations that we were able to do for the gradual weaning study, where we looked at how much they cost in terms of milk powder and creep intakes during that weaning period. Um, I haven't done so much on return because it's just kind of outside of the scope of my study, but there is a little bit more being done. I think I read a recent paper about it. But generally, there just needs to be more goat specific work, and it's quite hard because there's this huge variability across the systems and across the whole industry to do cost and return calculations. And there's no centralized data point, which makes it quite tricky.
Yes, the inevitable farmer question of what the economics is. Janyan asks, thank you for a very nice talk. As you mentioned, there are some unpredictable surprises when doing a trial on a commercial farm. Based on your experience, what suggestions do you have for researchers who want to bring welfare research on commercial farms and still maintain the scientific quality of the study? I'm also wondering, have you communicated to the ad libitum feeding gradual weaning results from your study to the farmers to get further feedback on this? So
Okay.
maybe we'll start with the question of what suggestions do you have for researchers who want to bring welfare research to commercial farms?
Okay. That's a really great question, actually. I think buy-in is really important. You've got to get that farmer to want to work with you and to have some sort of reason and some sort of buy-in as to why that would be valuable to them, why they should do it, and really get them to invest. So what I found when I was working on this commercial farm, it was really challenging. I had issues. The farmer, he was extremely enthusiastic, and then filtering it down to the farm staff who were there daily was quite tricky at times. So one of the key questions that I now ask before when I'm talking to a farmer is, what about the day-to-day management of this study? Who is going to be managing it? Can I have a meeting with them? Because getting the buy-in of the people who are on the ground is essential. And often all your communication is at a slightly higher level, especially on large farms with managers, with the person who's overall responsible. But you're not filtering down to talk to those people who are feet on the ground doing the work. And they're the people that you need the most. So one of my top tips is become really good at baking. a lot of cakes were distributed whilst doing studies on commercial farms. There was unashamed bribery of giving people eggs and honey and whatever I had to try and make sure that they would keep my study running in the best way possible. But it is tough. And in terms of scientific quality, it can be quite difficult because you're working within the confines of their current management. So I would have really liked to track kids for longer post-weaning, but they all got moved and mixed in a separate barn. And the way that the farm worked with moving kids through the barn just meant there was no way that they would delay that from me. And I wish I'd had better conversations very early on, and that's what I've learned is getting those really early conversations on, sharing your protocols for comments, coming back to them with a revised protocol so they feel like you've listened to them is something that I think is key. And it's all about buy-in and building a relationship, I think.
Relationships are key, and there's nothing like a baked good to fill in all of the cracks. I have been there, done that. And then also Jen had asked, have you communicated your experiment on the ad libitum feeding and gradual weaning to the farmers and received any feedback?
So that is next on my list of things to do. So we were waiting for the paper to officially come out, and it only came out last week. So that's really high on my list of priorities now. So I do have really good contact with a couple of like the industry bodies have little focus groups of dairy farmers who supply them with milk. And I've got a little bit of in there. So I'm hoping to get to one of their farmer meetings to disseminate this, as well as Volac, who lent me the feeding machine. We're potentially going to be writing some sort of more science communication, general public style writing on this to disseminate it further. So that's a key part of the PhD that I haven't quite gotten to yet.
Very cool. Daniela asks, do you know if most of the farmers keep the goat kids on the farm, or do most of them bring them to fattening facilities? And can you say what is the average mortality rate of goat kids?
Okay, so it depends on the farm. I've predominantly focused on dairy farms because they're the ones artificially rearing their kids and removing them at a young age and putting on these artificial milk supply systems. And typically, almost all of the commercial dairy farms are rearing all of their own female replacement kids. There are large concerns about biosecurity in the dairy goat industry. So most of them run closed herds. So they are pretty much all rearing their own replacements. It's very rare that they are buying and selling dairy female goats. In terms of fattening, most of them are moving the male kids on at a very early age. So some of them go to specific fattening facilities. They tend to be very small scale, quite a few niche businesses doing this in the UK now. But with the rising cost of milk powder, unfortunately, I'm aware of 2 that have stopped in the last year. So unsure what's going to happen with the industry for male dairy goat kids at the minute. There are more and more being reared, and I hope that we'll see that keep happening in high welfare facilities. In terms of average mortality rate, it wasn't part of my study. There have been a couple of communications about it. So I believe Laura Deeming wrote one, and the Todd et al. 2019 paper also has mortality rate estimates in it.
Thank you, Holly. I don't see any more questions coming in. So just in case someone is still typing, I will ask one last of my own. You displayed a table near the beginning of your presentation of the importance of factors when deciding to change in regards to the farmers. And it seems that scientific evidence was pretty important to farmers. And I wonder if you could describe the scientific outreach these farmers might experience, as in how do they receive the latest scientific information? Is it from field days, social media? Are they reading scientific papers, or is that something that we just don't know yet?
Okay, this is something that I find really interesting. So they all said that scientific evidence is really important. But when, in my experience of speaking to farmers, goat farmers are generally quite proactive. I've experienced really good conversations with farmers around how they engage with scientific evidence. There's a number of societies. So in the UK, we have the Goat Veterinary Society, which was set up largely because farmers are really frustrated by lack of veterinary knowledge for goats. They're considered a minority species. Drugs aren't licensed for them. So you need a vet who really understands goats to give advice. And they've been really engaged, and they've produced quite a lot of articles around their policy statements, their position statements, and some training days, which I think filters through their vets very, very well. And they do allow farmers to be members. I've been to a couple of their conferences, and there have been a lot of farmers in attendance, which I found really positive, really engaged, and that's super useful. I don't generally think that they're reading the scientific articles themselves, and they're relying on advisors who come to the farm, often tangentially, to be disseminating this kind of information. And therefore, I think as researchers, we need to see those people as a really key in. The boots on the ground people who are going to the farms to talk to them about different things are our way of filtering information through, because they're also the ones who are reading scientific articles, but quite varied across the goat industry.
Well, thank you so much, Holly, for a fantastic presentation and for really thorough answers to all of these questions. It's been a pleasure having you here. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to email or Twitter me, and the slides will be available as well.